Bruce Catton never imagined that an engineering report forgotten in the Washington archives would reveal the insane moment of Grant's military career. A moment Lee didn't even realize was happening. June 14, 1864. 115,000 men. 2 rivers. And Lee awaiting an attack on Richmond that would never come. What Catton discovered wasn't just a military maneuver. It was definitive proof that Grant possessed something no general in American history had demonstrated before, the ability to make 115,000 men vanish right under the enemy's nose. And it all happened in exactly 8 hours that defined who would win the Civil War. Bruce Catton was never just a historian. He was obsessed with details others ignored. For decades, he had chased a question that kept him up at night. How did Grant manage to cross the James River without Lee noticing? All the books said, Grant crossed the river. Period. As if it were simple. Then Catton understood something revolutionary. No one had read the engineers' reports. Everyone focused on the generals. On the battle maps. On Lincoln's letters. It was in 1967, while researching for Grant Takes Command, that Catton discovered a yellowed folder in the National Archives. Report from Chief Engineer Colonel James C. Duane. Date, June 15, 1864. Catton read that line and his heart raced. Pontoon bridge completed. 2,100 feet. Construction time, 8 hours. 101 pontoons. 4-foot tidal current. 0 casualties. 8 hours. In his entire career researching the Civil War, he had never found a feat of engineering so impossible. Accomplished while the enemy was just 20 miles away. Catton had spent 3 years doing what few historians did, reading technical reports. Private soldiers' diaries. Weather records. Colonel Duane's report was 47 pages long. Handwritten. Never published. He started reading at 9 a.m. when he next checked the clock. It was 4 p.m. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't moved. Because he was reading the minute-by-minute description of the most important day of Grant's career. Duane wrote, General Grant appeared at 5:30 a.m. on the riverbank. Said not a word. Just stared at the current for 3 minutes. Then turned and said, Colonel, you have until 2 in the afternoon. 2 in the afternoon. 8.5 hours to build the largest military bridge in history. Under a scorching sun. With a tidal current so strong they had to anchor schooners in the middle of the river to hold the pontoons. Catton did the math that night, 2,100 feet divided by 8 hours. It meant the engineers had to place a 30-foot pontoon every 4 minutes and 45 seconds. Non-stop. For 8 hours. And what if Lee found out? His cannons were 20 miles away. His cavalry was patrolling. A single Confederate scout could destroy the entire plan. To understand what Catton discovered, we need to go back to June 3, 1864. Cold Harbor. The worst day of Grant's life. 7,000 casualties. In 20 minutes. Soldiers writing their names on paper and pinning them to the backs of their uniforms to be identified after death. Grant wrote in his memoirs, as Catton read, Cold Harbor is the only attack I always regretted ordering. The situation had turned into a nightmare. Lee was entrenched between Grant and Richmond. The Chickahominy Swamp separated the armies. And Lincoln? Lincoln was in Washington, sleepless for weeks. 1864 was an election year. The Peace Democrats were shouting in the streets, end this war. Let the South go. If Grant didn't capture Richmond by November, Lincoln would lose the election. And the Union? The Union could end. June 5, 1864. At 11:30 p.m., according to the telegram Catton found, Grant sent a message to General Halleck in Washington. The enemy acts purely on the defensive behind entrenchments. Without a greater sacrifice of human life than I am willing to make, I cannot accomplish what I planned. I will move the army south of the James River. Catton realized, this wasn't a message of surrender. It was a checkmate being announced. Grant was about to do something Lee thought was impossible. Because moving 115,000 men, 5,000 wagons, 56,000 horses, 2,700 head of cattle across 2 rivers, the Chickahominy and the James, while Lee watched? It was the perfect moment for Lee to attack. Exactly as Lee had done to other Union generals. Attack when they're vulnerable crossing a river. But Catton discovered that in that moment of apparent chaos, Grant did something that changed not just that battle, but the nature of modern warfare. He transformed movement into invisibility. Grant didn't attack Richmond. He didn't hesitate. Instead, at 8 p.m. on June 12, he gave an order his own generals thought would be suicide. Absolute silence. No campfires. No bugles. We start moving at 9 p.m. Catton realized that order wasn't just tactical. It was psychological. Grant was betting everything on something no general had tried before, making an army of 115,000 men disappear. A soldier from the 5th Corps wrote in his diary, quoted by Catton, "We wrapped the wheel irons in cloth. Orders were whispered. It felt like we were stealing the very night." And as Grant moved his army south, he did something genius. He left campfires burning, straw dummies in trenches, isolated sharpshooters firing randomly. Lee looked at that, thinking Grant was still there. June 13th. Dawn. The first regiments began crossing the Chickahominy. At 10 a.m., Grant crossed the river and rode straight to the bank of the James. The James River. 700 yards wide at that point. 4-foot tidal current. Water speed, 4 knots. The engineers looked at it and said, "Impossible to build a bridge here, General. The current will destroy the pontoons." Grant lit a cigar, looked at the river, and said, "According to Duane's report Catton discovered, Colonel, Lee thinks I'm still at Cold Harbor. That gives us 24 hours. You have until 2 p.m. to prove it's possible." At 6 a.m., 450 engineers began. They worked in 2 teams. One from each bank. Catton describes in Grant Takes Command, 101 pontoons, 30 feet each. Wooden planks connected with 6-inch ropes. And in the middle of the river, where the current was so strong the pontoons couldn't hold on their own, they anchored 3 schooners. Sailing ships turned into floating piers. At 2 p.m., June 14, 1864, exactly 8 hours later, the last pontoon was placed. The largest military bridge in history was complete. And Lee? Lee still thought Grant was at Cold Harbor. Catton discovered something in the Confederate archives that took his breath away. A letter from General Lee to Jefferson Davis, dated June 15. Catton quotes in his book, "I still cannot determine Grant's intention. His movements are obscure." June 15. Grant already had 50,000 men across the river. And Lee didn't know. Catton found the diary of Colonel Charles Wainwright, Chief of Artillery. Entry for June 15. "We crossed the James today. I looked back and saw 50,000 men crossing that endless bridge. And I thought, this Grant is different from the others. He doesn't think like the others think." Catton did the math in Grant Takes Command. In 3 days, they crossed that bridge, 115,000 soldiers, 5,000 supply wagons, 2,700 head of cattle, 56,000 horses and mules. A 50-mile-long column. Crossing a 2,100-foot bridge. Without Lee noticing. Catton never imagined this discovery would lead him to understand something much bigger. Grant had invented modern warfare. Rapid movement. Perfect logistics. Mass deception. It was 2:30 a.m. when Catton finally grasped the true meaning. He was in his office surrounded by piles of reports when the epiphany struck him like lightning. Grant hadn't just crossed a river. He had completely reinvented the concept of military initiative. Catton realized that every general before Grant operated on one logic: I will attack where the enemy is weak. Grant operated on another: I will be where the enemy is not. Catton discovered something even more extraordinary in the diaries of Confederate officers. After June 18, when Lee finally discovered Grant was at Petersburg, the attitude of Confederate soldiers completely changed. A Confederate colonel wrote, "We always beat Grant in battle. But somehow he always ends up closer to Richmond than before. How does he do it?" That was the secret. Grant had become psychologically immortal. He could lose battles. But he never lost momentum. Catton understood that those 8 hours on June 14 explained everything that came next. June 15, Union troops arrive at Petersburg. City defended by only 2,500 Confederates. Lee still at Cold Harbor. June 18, Lee finally arrives with 50,000 men. The window closed. Grant wrote in his memoirs, Catton quotes, "Petersburg could have been captured without great loss. This would have given us control of the railroads. But we hesitated." But here's what Catton realized: Grant had proven to himself that he could do the impossible. That 2,100-foot bridge built in 8 hours? It was physical proof that his mind operated on a different dimension. The Siege of Petersburg lasted 9 months. But the outcome was never in doubt. Because Grant had become, in Catton's words, psychologically inevitable. In the later years of his life, Catton often said that those 8 hours on June 14 taught him more about leadership than decades studying battles. Grant had discovered something that transcended military tactics: how to transform impossibility into inevitability. Catton's discovery revolutionized not just military history, but our complete understanding of how great leaders think under extreme pressure. That 2,100-foot bridge was dismantled on June 18. Wood recycled. Pontoons reused. But its true importance wasn't in the engineering. It was in the lesson Catton drew from it. We all have our impossible moments coming. The question is, when they arrive, will you hesitate like all the other Union generals hesitated? Or will you look at the impossible and say you have until 2 in the afternoon? Bruce Catton proved that history isn't dates. It's decisions. And that decision on June 14th? It defined who Grant was. If this video changed how you view leadership under pressure, hit like. And tell me in the comments, what detail of those 8 hours stuck with you the most?